In this episode, I'm joined by Dean Sluyter, meditation teacher and best-selling author of several books, including his most recent, The Dharma Bum's Guide to Western Literature, Finding Nirvana in the Classics. Dean recounts his fortunate upbringing, how he began to realize he had an unusually fast mind, and the early mystical experiences that would change his life in profound ways. Dean talks about his parents' radical left activism and how one event caused him to re-examine his family's beliefs. Dean also shares the arc of his spiritual life, including his psychedelic sadhu period, his 20 years as a teacher of Transcendental Meditation, while teaching English at the illustrious Pingry School, his studies in Buddhism and Dzogchen, and why he now considers himself to be a spiritual elder. So without further ado, Dean Sluyter. Dean Sluyter, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
Well, I'm so delighted to be talking with you today, having just finished reading your latest release, A Dharma Bum's Guide to Western Literature. So first of all, congratulations on your
thanks so
new
much.
book.
No, thank you. I'm very excited about finally getting this one written. This one was germinating literally for over 45 years. And I knew I had to write this. I knew I had to put this into the world. So I'm very glad to have it done.
We'll get into your biography, I think, sequentially, chronologically in a moment. But the story of this book's quite interesting. It came, from what I understand, from your teaching at the Pingry School.
Yes, I taught for 33 years at the Pingry School, which is a very sort of top-notch independent school in New Jersey. And I was already, my whole adult life practically, I've been teaching meditation and, pretty seriously hell-bent for leather on the enlightenment path. And so very naturally, those two things cross-germinated, cross-fertilized, and you come back year after year. You're teaching Huckleberry Finn again. You're teaching Macbeth again. You're teaching The Great Gatsby again. And if you're halfway awake, you keep getting deeper into them. And if you're pursuing Dharma awakening, as I was also doing, you start to see, gee, when Huck Finn rose into the middle of the Mississippi River with after evading his drunken murderous father, and finally relaxes and lies down on his back and has a little smoke out of his pipe and looks up into the moonlight, and he says, "The sky looks ever so deep when you lay on your back in the moonshine. I never knowed it before." I went, whoa, that's the initiation into the transcendent. Am I the first person who's seeing this? I don't know, but I guess I better write it down.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and you go through many of the great favorite authors that we've read, or at least wish to read, or would like to read, or maybe we have them on the shelf,
or we're supposed to read.
Yeah, and that was the case actually for you. We will get to your biography, but with Moby Dick, right?
Yes, Moby Dick, and I start the chapter with by coming clean, that for my 33 years of teaching school, every year I would make a little speech to my American Lit class about Moby Dick and what a great book it is, and you've got to read this one before you die, and I had never read it. And so finally my karma caught up to me that in order to write this book, I had to read Moby Dick, and fortunately I found out I had not been lying all those years, that it was that great, and greater and weirder and funnier, actually.
Yeah, I think actually this book, Dharma Bum's Guide to Western Literature, it serves a few purposes, and one of them is there are certainly some books in there that I haven't read, and that you give a nice overview not only of the book and then point to some Dharma interpretations from those books, but also you often talk about the life of the author and the ways in which that person's life is reflected in the text, or perhaps has some Dharma themes too. And I think so it's a good setup for those books, a sort of interesting primer or jumping off point
Yeah,
if one would then want to read those books later.
Yeah, I tried to write it in such a way that even if you had not read a given book, the chapter would still make sense. It would give you the information you needed. And in some cases, two things I love, I'm starting to get, the book just came out in late March, and I'm starting to get feedback from a number of readers. And two things I love hearing. One is, oh, you made me want to go out and read Virginia Woolf. You made me want to go and read Gerard Manley Hopkins. And the other is, gee, I wish you'd been my English teacher. So that's really lovely. But about the lives of the writers, I think that in literature, in the arts generally, and for that matter in the spiritual world, it's really important to emphasize that all this stuff comes through people. You know, it comes through humans who had to get up in the morning and feel groggy and cranky just like the rest of us, who had hopes, who had disappointments. You know, we tend to think of, people tend to maybe come through school and think of Shakespeare as an institution rather than a person. And in the same way, to think of the Buddha or Jesus as institutions, as these rarefied entities, that they, you know, weren't people who, you know, belched and farted like the rest of us. And I think that's important to know.
And that's a theme that I'd like to come back to later, that you raise, particularly in the Great Gatsby, talking about looking for that sense of completeness outside of ourselves, and that, you know, that the great yearning, as you describe, that Gatsby has. But let's come back to that a bit later.
Okay.
Your biography. So can you contextualize a bit your upbringing? What was your family context, and how did you begin life?
Well, I began life as the middle of three brothers. There was then a sister who came along some years later. A middle class house of leftist political activists on Long Island. We moved when I was 6 to California. My father was a musician, later became a lawyer. And, you know, so I was very fortunate. A lot of people, in order for them to come to the spiritual path, have to have really bad things happen to them. I think a lot of people, to really take the awakening path seriously, need to bottom out. It has to be a romantic crisis, a health crisis, something. I was lucky. You know, some tough things have happened to me, but mostly I've had a pretty easy life. This, you know, I mean, you know, my parents had some arguments, but nothing terrible. So, yeah, I grew up in that way. I was a super smart kid in school. I remember when I was first or second grade, I can remember other kids, when I would be responding to the teacher's questions, other kids turning around and looking at me like, and it was very clear to me, they thought I had this special thing inside my skull that they didn't have, some superpower that allowed me to understand things. But what I could see very clearly was, it was not that I had something that they lacked. It was the opposite. I could see that in their trying to process information, it was like there was obscuration there. It was like they were having to drag it through a certain quantity of peanut butter and sawdust, and I had empty space. And somehow that was, so for some reason, I had a lot of empty space all along that allowed me to kind of catch on to things quickly. I fell in love with words and literature early on. And because of some spontaneous experiences in childhood, I caught onto the spiritual path early on. One that I don't talk about in the book, but I think you'll find this interesting, because it's not as dramatic as the one I talk about in the book. It was more subtle and kept coming and going, was a sense that I didn't have a face, right? And that other people had faces. It was as if other people had a seam down the middle of the front of them that was closed, and mine had been left open. And that would come and go, and it would confuse me that other people would talk to me as if I was just like them, as if I was also closed in the front. Couldn't they see that, wow, this was wide open? Now, if my insight had been deeper, I would have realized that they were all actually open too. They just didn't realize it. But so that came and went, and then there was the very dramatic experience that I talk about at the beginning of the book, where one day, because despite this kind of this lovely openness, emptiness, there was also a lot of churning going on, kind of free-floating anxiety. And one day when I was 11 or 12, my mom sent me out to the garage to clear out all the books and comic books and toys that my brothers and I had left there, because we were going to go to something that existed in those days called a drive-in movie. And so I go out to the garage. My mind is churning as usual. What about this? What about that? The next thing that I pick up, and there's a picture of it here in the book. The next thing I pick up is a copy of Mad Magazine. And on the cover, as usual, is their idiot mascot, Alfred E. Newman, with his silly grin and his motto, "What? Me worry?" And suddenly, this is what in the Hindu tradition is called Mahavakya, great utterance, which in Hindu tradition usually is something like Aham Brahmasmi, right? I am Brahman, I am the infinite, or Tat Twamasi, thou art that, right? But in my case, the Mahavakya was, what? Me worry? And what I realized was this churning is a thing. It's not just the life, it's a thing that I'm doing. It's not being done to me. It's called worry. And because I'm doing it, I can stop doing it. And I took my foot off that pedal, and everything went deliciously, boundlessly silent. And it was really what later on I would, after doing some reading some years later, what I would describe as just full-blown, cut it with a knife, eat it with a spoon, samadhi experience. So that few things like that caught my attention.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. I'm wondering, you must have speculated about this or considered this. What do you think the peanut butter and sawdust, you use that metaphor, what is that?
Boy, that's a good question, because it's not only the obscuration. I mean, looking at it now, I would say, whatever it is, it's not only the obscuration to being able to process the information that you're learning, in the second grade, but it's the obscuration to perceiving directly our own true nature, which is boundlessness. And it's a great mystery because what the wisdom traditions conclude is that stuff, it has no substance. It has no substance. When all the enlightenment stories have a moment. It's kind of the Homer Simpson moment, the dope moment, which is, how did I ever miss this? How did I not see that I did not need any further objective experience? I didn't have to have anything added to or subtracted from the way I was experiencing things all the time. Here, it was all boundlessness all along. How did I fail to perceive that? So it's kind of a mystery. I do want to mention, however, that I used to be very hesitant about sharing some of these childhood personal experiences or any kind of personal awakening experiences, because it's too easy for that to be interpreted as an assertion that, oh, I'm special. And I think really this stuff happens to most people in one way or another, especially in childhood, but that just some of us it kind of got our attention more. I think some people just kind of dismiss it. They forget about it. In fact, in my chapter on Hemingway, where I discuss A Farewell to Arms, which is, a lot of it is based very closely on Hemingway's own experience as a volunteer driving an ambulance for the Italian army in the First World War. And there's a part where the hero is hit with shrapnel, with mortar fire, as Hemingway was, and he has a near-death experience. He essentially dies, and Hemingway describes it so clearly and intimately that you know only someone who had experienced that could describe it that way. And then at the end of it, you know, he breathes again and slides back into his body. Just classic near-death experience description. But as you know from talking to so many people on the awakening path, generally they have this kind of near-death experience and it catches their attention. They go, oh, death isn't, so-called death, there's nothing tragic about it. It's very expansive. It's right. Whereas for the hero of A Farewell to Arms, as apparently for Hemingway as well, it's completely forgotten. You know, the next chapter, he's deeply into war and whiskey and women and bemoaning all the death around him, and it's never mentioned again.
You know, it seems that from your description there, you noticed you were processing things a bit faster than the others. You were less inhibited in your processing speed. And it seemed they had peanut butter and sawdust in there, you know,
yeah.
Obscuring, using that word obscuration.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm wondering a few things actually. And you've said that not only allows you to engage with your academic studies at school better than others, but also you said that maybe this is the same dimension that opens one up to spiritual insights, as we'd call them, right? Mystical insights and so on. Have you found or noticed a certain talent or inclination or disposition throughout your meditative career? Did states come easier to you? Did experiences come easier to you than your colleagues who are also on that path? Did you find your experience in school, in other words, looking around at the other students and them looking back at you, did you find that mirrored in your own spiritual path?
No, not really. Not really. I would say that I talked a better game. You know, and sometimes maybe my talking about the stuff outpaced the actual experience, but certain kinds of things, you know, it was very interesting teaching, all my years teaching English at this prep school. I also taught meditation there. I got meditation programs going. In particular, I started an elective course for juniors and seniors called, 11th and 12th graders, called Literature of Enlightenment. And there we read the Gospel According to Thomas, we read Salinger, we read Kerouac, we read Zen stories, Zen Flesh, Zen Bones, the Plato Symposium. It was just wonderful. And everyone knew my classroom because it was the one that had, instead of rows of straight back wooden desk chairs, it had a circle of comfy couches, because our lab work, so-called, was a lot of meditation. And actually, every course that I taught there turned out to be a way to sneak meditation in there. When I taught American Lit, we started with the Transcendentalists, Emerson and Thoreau, and you can't understand the Transcendentalists without transcending. So, you know, and it was great, because once I led the kids in a 15-minute meditation, then every day for the rest of the year, as they come in, they'd say, Mr. Sluyter, can we meditate today? I'd say, well, if we really knuckle down on our work, maybe on Friday, right? And what I discovered was that, teenagers take to meditation quicker than adults in general. And of the teenagers, the ones who get it right away are the jocks, and the ones who take a little longer are the valedictorians. Okay, because the jocks are used to processing things in a simple, direct way. It doesn't all have to get filtered through the intellect. They're used to experiencing things viscerally, whereas the valedictorians, you know, have to kind of argue with themselves about it a little more before they surrender.
That's very interesting. A couple more questions about that period of your life.
Mm-hmm.
You're mentioning that this difference you noticed between yourself and your classmates in processing speed. What did you notice? What was your emotional and social, I suppose, development like at that time?
Well, there were two factors two major factors in addition to the one that you're thinking of. One is that we moved several times. When I was 6, we left Long Island. We moved to Cedar Hill, Missouri, a little rural area, at least at the time, outside of St. Louis, where my father, who was an oboe player, played a season with the St. Louis Symphony. And then we moved to California, Southern California. But in the next few years, we moved a number of times. So I was always the new kid. And then the second thing was that the school pretty soon skipped me a grade. So I was a year younger than the other kids. And I think that being the new kid in particular was, you know, where everyone's already formed their cliques and so forth. And, you know, how do I deal with this? And what I discovered was I could deal with it by being clever and funny. And that's stood me in pretty good stead ever since. Also, the fact that I was the middle of 3 brothers. You learn fast footwork in that situation. You're in the middle of all the cross currents.
Yeah, very interesting. I'm curious, you mentioned your parents were, you said, leftist activists.
Yeah.
Yeah, could you say a little about that and to what degree that's influenced you? I know, are you yourself, do you consider yourself to be following in that tradition, or have you parted from that? Have you nuanced it to some degree? It seems you have, actually, reading the Dharma Bum's Guide to Western Literature. It's quite nuanced, your read on things. I'm curious about that aspect too.
Yeah. I love your question, Steve, by the way. Really, you're digging into some nuances of the story that other people have not done, and I'm enjoying this a lot.
Thank you.
Just wanted to mention that. Yeah, my mom in particular was always they were both involved in peace activism and in particular, there was a number of organizations they were involved with. Later on, in the early 70s, they hosted the local chapter of the Friends of the Black Panthers, which met in their living room. That was interesting in a very suburban white area of Los Angeles. Earlier, my mom was very active in the Committee to Secure Justice for Morton Sobell. Now, Morton Sobell is a now pretty much forgotten historical figure. He was the co-defendant of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And after Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed, Sobell was in prison on a long prison sentence. And I remember my mom going on fundraising activities with Sobell's wife while I would be home playing with Sobell's son. So I kind of grew up with this doctrine of how these people had been persecuted, unfairly persecuted for being supposedly involved in seditious activity, and that, not so coincidentally, they were all Jewish, and that the people attacking them were right-wingers, and some anti-Semitism going on there, and so on and so forth. Fast forwarding to about, I think it was 1967 or 1968. At this point, I'm in San Francisco. I've completed 1 year of college, and I've dropped out. I'm a full-on hippie, just kind of a psychedelic sadhu. And I believe I was walking through the Fleischacker Zoo in San Francisco one morning, and I saw a newspaper headline or heard news on someone's radio that Morton Sobel had been released. And that was sort of just a big moment for me. But even more significant, some years later, Sobel came clean, and he said, "Yeah, I was guilty all along." And there's been some evidence in recent years indicating that, yeah, Julius and Ethel, or certainly Julius, he did what he was accused of doing, helping to steal atomic secrets. And it was very liberating for me to find out that a doctrine I'd grown up with was wrong. That, even if you're persecuted by bad people for bad reasons, it might turn out that you did what you were accused of doing in this case. Finding out you were wrong about something is, I keep discovering, a precious opportunity, because, well, I'm going to relate it to something that is not going to sound related initially. I used to play a little bit of saxophone, not very well, in the school where I taught. I used to sit in with the jazz band. And one day I asked the band instructor, who's a good friend of mine, Sean McAnally, who's actually a wonderful musician. I said, "Okay, Sean, what's the deal on improvisation? Right? Give me the secret. What's the key to improvisation?" He says, "Well, you think of something and then don't play that." Right? Can you feel that? Because the moment you think of something, and it's interesting because when you see young jazzers trying to do it, as they're playing, you can hear them thinking. You can hear them thinking the melody they're improvising. But he said, but the moment you think it, that's already stale. The moment you think it, that's a structure of thought, and that's a limited area. And out here, there is the boundless area that is not inside what you've thought. So you think of something and don't play that. That means you go into free fall. And it's the wonderful liberation from that constriction of thought structure. And that's why it's so exciting to hear good jazz, because they're in free fall, and you can follow them into that. And the beginning of that word free fall is free. I saw once an interview with the drummer who worked with John Coltrane, and someone asked him, "Well, what was it like to play with Coltrane?" He said, "You had to be ready to die with the motherfucker."
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah,
for Coltrane.
That recklessness, that willingness to give up all your handholds. So anytime that comes along, and this is a running gag with my wife and I, that because we both know it feels so good to be right, but it's a cheap high. It comes at a cost. So we play at because in marriage you get so many wonderful opportunities to explore this stuff if you use those opportunities. And she'll be sure that whatever we need to buy toothpaste, something stupid, and I'll be sure we don't, or vice versa. And then it turns out I was right. And she'll say, "Dean, you were right." And I go, ooh, say it again.
Can I have that in writing?
Say it again. Faster, right? And it's, but because the real high, the real liberation is to be wrong. Whoa, I was so sure. I find this out when I watch movies. Sometimes I'll experience, there was some scene in a movie I saw 5, 10, 20 years ago. And I loved this scene. It was so potent. And I've described that scene to people over and over. And then I watch the movie again after many years and find out the scene's completely different from the way I've been describing it. Now, how many things are there like that in my own life where I don't get a chance to go back to a filmed record? Right? How many things that I'm sure of are just because what we do is when we're sure of something, there's only one thing that's sure, and that's not a thing. That's the boundlessness. That's the nature of existence. That's beingness. That's the only thing that has absolute status. So anytime we're sure of anything, we are falsely ascribing that absolute status to something that's relative. And that's idolatry. That's blasphemy, actually. And the reason that it's a sin in Judeo-Christian terms is that it keeps us bound.
It seems that surety, that certainty, that rightness is one of the great appeals of political doctrines and political positions, be it the left or the right or any shade across that whole political spectrum.
Yes, yes, and we have one prominent. I won't even say this person's name, but one prominent politician here who discovered this great trick. Anything he doesn't like, he says fake news, and it's like a superpower. It's and because sorting out relative reality and policy stuff and all that's hard work. And people are tired of the complexity of the world and trying to figure out what do we need to do about climate and and all that. And you can just say fake news. These people are all child molesters, but these easy answers, and then it makes them completely immune to evidence. They're getting high on that sureness. But as I said before, it's a cheap high. It's like drinking cheap wine. It'll get you there, but there's a lot of collateral damage.
It's difficult to relinquish that certainty, that firm ground, especially when one's invested in it through action or identity, perhaps one's identities, or one's indeed family of origin. What do you think has enabled you to explore the uncertainty, to somehow it seems to thrive in it to a certain extent? You seem to have got a taste for it. That seems unusual and a useful thing for especially when we do see, it seems, at least that's what we're told, who knows if it's true, we do see political polarization and entrenchment and difficulty of communicating with people with different so on. How have you achieved that?
Well, it's an ongoing process. I fall into the addiction to being right a lot, and again, marriage is great for that. Bachelorhood can be very dangerous because you're just left alone with no all day you can sit around being right with no one to point out your follies to you. So, there's that. Teaching school, I used to come up with thought experiments for my students. I'd say, okay, how many of you, I don't care if you're, let's say, a conservative or a liberal, but how many of you would say that your overall political orientation is pretty much the same as that of your parents? And 90% of them will raise their hands. And I'll say, Now, isn't that interesting? Notice how sure you feel that obviously any right-thinking person would have politics like one's own. Now, what if you'd been born in the house next door where they have opposite political convictions? You would be equally sure that all right-thinking people feel that way. And I would just try to come up with things like that to soften it up, to relativize it. Also, being involved with a number of spiritual teachers and one of my favorite oxymorons, spiritual organizations, because I've always had a little bit of a streak of fanaticism. I always felt, okay, I have to find not just a way that works, but the way that's the best, not only for me, but for everyone, and the way to express it. It's taken me years to soften up my former conviction that, there was some magic words. If I could just get this thing phrased just right, I could, come down from the top of the mountain and deliver this message and everyone who heard it would go, yes, right, of course, thank you. And of course, it doesn't work that way. But my kind of fanatical drive to find the way has gotten me involved with a number over the years. Some teachers, I felt, okay, this is the teacher. This is the way to teach. And I think you know what the end of this story is going to be, right? And every time I've gotten too comfortable in some doctrinal nest, I've wound up getting kicked out of the nest. And it's always been traumatic, and then it's always been great, just the best thing that could have happened for me.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you about that point, actually. I've heard you say that before, that every time you get comfortable in a nest, you get kicked out of it. What you were saying earlier reminds me of an author who I know you like, but didn't include Herodotus. He makes that point that every person prefers his own culture and feels intrinsically somehow, he makes that point, is best,
Yes.
Oh, the Greeks, we feel that we're the best, and the Persians think they're the best, and the Ethiopians think they're the best, these sorts of nations that or he was dealing with at that time. We all have that intrinsic sense. I always thought that was Herodotus being funny. I'm not sure if it was. But,
right.
But anyway, so let's get on that track then. So you dropped out of college, as you said, and for 2 years, you lived this psychedelic sadhu life, as you mentioned. Yeah, that sounds very interesting indeed. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that and how it was you came upon TM, which you were going to teach for quite a lot of time, and eventually that was one of the nests that you found yourself kicked out of. But I wonder if you could tell us that story.
Yeah. So I finished my first year of college. I was at San Francisco State College. And now it was June of 1967, which, as you probably know, that was the summer of love. So I was in the right place at the right time. And I had started doing some exploration with psychedelics in my last year or so of high school. So the idea of going back to school in the fall was just not so right, summer of 67, and Sergeant Pepper hit the stands that June, and there was this sudden feeling and I went to the Monterey Pop Festival at that time, and that. Everyone knows about the music there, but that was what not everyone, I think, realizes. That was probably the first, maybe the second event. The earlier one was the Human Being in Golden Gate Park some months earlier with Tim Leary and Allen Ginsberg and that whole cast of characters. That those couple of events really became sort of the gathering of the tribes. There had been a lot of people kind of exploring on their own and through psychedelics, discovering quite instantly, here is, if it was not the opening to the infinite, it was some a pretty provocative facsimile of it. Something that was enough to get a lot of people's attention. So what people realized was, oh, I'm not the only one. That this is a movement. This is a cultural movement. And there was a lot of excitement in the air, and there really was a feeling that, there's going to be this huge cultural shift, that the old model is out. I knew people whose plan was they were going to cut their hair, go to Washington, D.C., get a job as a waiter in the White House, slip acid into Lyndon Johnson's coffee cup, and then he and Ho Chi Minh would, with a rose in their teeth, weeping tears of sorrow and love, and they would end the Vietnam War. And a lot of it can sound silly in retrospect, but in the excitement of the moment, this is what it felt like. There is, there's a very interesting so-called underground newspaper that was being published at the time, the San Francisco Oracle. And they published a piece that was a transcript. And for people who are really interested in the history of the era, this is a fascinating document. They published a transcript of a sort of informal symposium that was held on Alan Watts's houseboat in, I think, Tiburon, just north of San Francisco. And it was Alan Watts, Allen Ginsberg, Tim Leary, and one or two other people I don't remember. Gary Snyder, I think. And the title, the subject of discussion was "Drop Out or Take Over," as if we had that choice. So in my wanderings in that time, I felt, okay, this thing is going on. And I would hitchhike into some place. I remember walking into some supermarket somewhere in Oregon or somewhere, and I had, big red blonde hair down to my shoulders and a beard. And I was the first male adult that a lot of people had ever seen with long hair. I remember some woman in the aisle with her groceries just stopping in her tracks saying, "Jesus Christ." And then I did discover that, as I say in the book, that the cops often were not very enthusiastic about their little Midwestern towns being invaded by long-haired psychedelic visionaries. So I did get locked up a couple of times for, hitchhiking, vagrancy, loitering, all of these euphemisms for being a hippie.
That's very funny. And how did you come across TM? Was that during this wandering phase?
Well, what happened was I had a couple of friends who had started, and I had been reading the Bhagavad Gita and reading the Upanishads in some of the translations that were available at that time. And the impression that I got that a lot of people were getting, and historically, for hundreds of years, many people have gotten the impression from those works that if you're serious about enlightenment, that what those books are telling you to do is you have to, deny the world. You have to be a monk, essentially. That was, and that's a tall order. Most of us are not built for that. But then what happened was I came down with hepatitis. And I had to go home back to my parents' place in the Los Angeles suburbs to recuperate. And while I was there, a friend of mine who'd started TM gave me a copy of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi's translation and commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, chapters 1 through 6. He never did the other 12 chapters. But what he does in his commentary on the Gita there is he parses each verse and says, no, this is not telling you that you have to be a monk, that, that's too gross, that's too outward, This is describing a state of consciousness where you're realizing the nature of beingness, which is independent of the shifting conditions in the material world. It's not telling you have to put away the material world. And that it doesn't involve necessarily long hours of meditation that also requires a monastic life. You can do it in 20 minutes twice a day. Well, that was an offer I couldn't refuse. It was I had to try it, and so I did. I learned TM. I attended my first introductory lecture on TM at Santa Monica Civic Auditorium, which is about a mile from where I live now. And one of the instructions was that if you're sick, don't do just the 20 minutes twice a day. You can do more. So I asked, okay, I'm recuperating from hepatitis. How much should I meditate? And the fellow, actually a man named Jerry Jarvis, a wonderful man who died a few years ago and was kind of Maharishi's right-hand man in America. He said, well, more. An hour in the morning, hour in the evening, half an hour in the afternoon. So that was quite a bit of meditation. I started doing it, and I started waking up in the mornings with a big smile on my face. So I thought, okay, this stuff works. And this stuff, and I really kind of knew this even before I learned it. I said one of the reasons I was motivated was that Maharishi's whole packaging of it this was in a form that it's like, okay, I can bring this to the burbs. Right, because the whole thing in that 1967 Summer of Love moment had been so much promulgated in the sense of that it's a counterculture thing, right? And certain people who had personalities, Tim Leary in a way was the worst at this, of making it us versus them, but I knew that the mission, you had to be able to bring this home to mom and dad. You had to be able to bring this to the suburbs. And, okay, 20 minutes twice a day, you don't have to believe in anything. You don't have to change your diet. You don't have to sit on the floor in the lotus pose. I said, that's, I probably the most brilliant bit of spiritual PR since St. Paul decided that if you wanted to follow Jesus, you didn't have to follow the kosher laws and get circumcised. And it was brilliant. And Maharishi was just a brilliant, pivotal figure in bringing meditation and awakening into mainstream Western culture. So, and it gave me an excuse to stop taking drugs, because to learn TM, you had to stop taking any kind of drugs for 15 days. So I had someone else outside to tell me, okay, you could, because I was getting so tired of going up and down like a yo-yo, with the acid. And so, yeah, that was great. And Maharishi said, and so I knew I wanted to be a teacher of it. And, Maharishi told us all, okay, but you got to cut your hair, go back, finish college, have a degree, wear a tie. It was great. I have photos of us on these long meditation retreats, 6-month retreats with Maharishi. We're all in jackets and ties. It's hilarious.
And that was in 1970 that you graduated as a teacher, and you went on to teach TM for 20 years.
Yeah, until the early 90s, right.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us a sense of the arc of your practice over that period of time? You're teaching, you're practicing, you're in TM. Yes. Eventually, as you mentioned, for various reasons, which you can touch on if you'd like to. I think it's very interesting. You left the movement, but during that time when you're in the movement and you're teaching and practicing, can you give us a sense of your own personal arc as a practitioner during that time?
Yeah. Well, one thing, and Maharishi used to say this to the teachers, and Maharishi, he spoke in maxims. He would say these certain things over and over that I still have dozens of them in my head, and one of them was the teacher always gains more than the student. And that's true of anything. I mean, you know, if you want to master, I don't know, fishing or horseback riding or anything, you know, music, anything, go out and teach it. And there is a real magic in teaching TM, and you know, part of it is just articulating the nuances of not only during the time of meditation, but the integration into daily life, and Maharishi had us, you know, come back and spend time with him, ideally twice a year, you know, come on refresher courses and so forth. So the meditation itself was great. The teaching was great. What I started to see lacking was that the idea of, okay, just 20 minutes twice a day, set it and forget it. You know, and he framed it that way because as an antidote to what he called mood making, people making a mood of enlightenment. And I'm sure you've encountered people like that, you know, that they kind of whip up some attitude. Sometimes they'll talk very softly, right? And it's like, okay, we're all very, very enlightened here, and sort of as an antidote to that, Maharishi, I think, you know, quite brilliantly said, just meditate twice a day. It's like, you know, taking a time release capsule and forget it. The settling down into the wakeful hypometabolic state, what the ancients called turiya, the fourth state, wakeful alertness, rather restful alertness, that's a neurophysiological thing. It happens spontaneously. Meditate and forget about it, plunge back into activity. And then relating that to the message of the Bhagavad Gita. You know, the two verses, his two favorite verses from the Bhagavad Gita, Nistraigunyo Bhavarjun, you know, be without... Chapter 2, verse 45, be without the three gunas, O Arjuna. In other words, transcend the whole world of activity. That's meditation. And then chapter 2, verse 48, yogastha kuru karmani, established in yoga, established in this beingness, come out and perform dynamic action. You know, the advice given to Arjuna, the warrior, just before going into battle. Right? That's the model for the spiritual life, not running away from life. So that was all great. But I started to realize that, you know, it's not enough, that the other 23 hours of the day also can be a field for practice. And it doesn't have to be mood making. Right? That there are practices of insight and self-inquiry and of noting you know, simple things and simple human things, which in all my books I try to emphasize these. That when you're, for example, when you're the passenger in a car, and you realize you don't have a lot of confidence in the person who's driving, right? And you find your body tightening up, and you find your right foot going for that non-existent passenger side brake, you know, stomping on that brake, you know what I'm talking about, right? And then realizing, oh, that brake doesn't work. It doesn't stop the car. It doesn't slow it down even a little bit. So either I'm going to say to the driver, listen, why don't you let me drive, or sit back and relax. One or the other. Everything else in between is non-skillful. It's constrictive. Right? And, you know, simple, homely examples like that, I find people really respond to. They really, stuff that you can feel somatically. I go, now, how many other kinds of things like that are there in your life where you're going for that passenger side brake? Right? Realizing that doesn't work is powerfully liberative. Right? So that's just one example. So that's one example of how the other 23 hours of the day when we're not meditating can all be used as opportunities for awakening. And so the TM program, Maharishi's teaching, didn't embrace that. And also, there was a lot of kind of what you were saying before about the Greeks, a lot of feeling of, okay, TM is the way, which had early on appealed to my fanatical streak, but later on, the dogmatism of it just started to get to be too constrictive. And Maharishi started going into some funny directions that I just couldn't follow. The thing that was the final straw for me. So I mentioned I was teaching this Literature of Enlightenment course at the Pingry School, and for the meditation component, they were all learning TM. And I was teaching them the orthodox way within the TM organization, and they were all paying what was the standard fee for high school students at the time, which was $85. And I always made it clear most of these kids came from wealthy families, but I said anyone for whom that's a problem, come to me quietly, we'll arrange a scholarship. It was great. It was in the summer of 1993, and I was out in California with my mom, who was dying of cancer. And my wife, back at home, Maggie, got the word from the TM organization that they were raising the prices. And now instead of the high schoolers paying $85, they had to pay $2,500. And we spent the whole summer, this was before the days of email, so sending letters and faxes and leaving voice messages, trying to reach someone in the organization to say, okay, you can have a special dispensation and teach at the old price, because I knew that otherwise it was going to, it was going to wreck my program. I couldn't charge the kids that. And I never heard back from anyone in the organization. Actually, a year later, I heard back from someone's secretary. Oh, you're having a problem? I said, way too late. That ship has sailed. And it was great, because actually I wound up later that summer attending a retreat in Brighton Bush Hot Springs in Eastern Oregon with Ram Dass, who was always just such a wonderful, open, human approach to these things. Very, as they say in Yiddish, very Hamisha approach to these things. And he had a number of younger teachers doing afternoon workshops in various kinds of meditation and so forth. And I made the great discovery, which was, see, the key thing about TM, I failed to mention this, is effortlessness. That true meditation is always effortless. That I know you've interviewed Rupert Spira, and Rupert puts this, as he puts most things, quite brilliantly. People think that that meditation is something that you do, but meditation is what you are, right? So the way I put it is, any effort to create a non-agitated state of mind is itself a form of agitation, right? So that's anytime people talk about trying to meditate, that's the catch-22. Trying to meditate doesn't work. So the skill of teaching meditation is pulling that rug of effort out from under people so that they go, oh, free fall. This is so much simpler and easier and faster, and it works. But Maharishi had kind of, part of the whole TM doctrine was that everyone else teaches effort, where TM is the only method that teaches effortlessness. And what I discovered that summer in Brighton Bush Hot Springs with these other teachers was, no, there's other, TM does not have a monopoly on effortlessness. So it was great. That fall I was able to go back to school and continue to teach the kids meditation without TM, and I was out of that nest. And you know what? All the books that I've written would have been impossible if I'd stayed in the TM nest. And I have friends who've been in that nest for all this time, for decades. Some of them dear friends, and and some of them are great. They're fine. They have a kind of very relaxed, open attitude about things. And some of them, it's really hard to talk to them. They're so kind of stuck and so blinded. But I could say that about people stuck in any, system of doctrine.
Any fixed view.
Any fixed view. That's exactly right. And you can see with, whether it's a doctrinaire TM teacher or a what it is, it's fundamentalism of any stripe. And I think in any spiritual organization or movement or teaching, you find people who are the fundamentalists and the people who are, mellow, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, that's very interesting indeed. I think we could talk in even greater depth on that subject, but I am curious about what it's like to leave an organization like that, to find yourself, I suppose, outside of that spiritual identity or that spiritual group belonging. I'm not sure how much of the TM organization supplied those things for you, but what was it like leaving? I know later on you've also studied Vajrayana Buddhism and Advaita and Bhakti Yoga and even Umbanda, which is I'd really like to hear about those things and perhaps some sort of potted history. What was that period like after you left TM?
I wrote about I wrote a book in 2005 called Cinema Nirvana, Enlightenment Lessons from the Movies. The cover shows a golden Buddha clutching a box of popcorn. And I did in that book pretty much what I do for literature in the Dharma Bum's Guide. And I take deliberately movies that you would not think of as being as having spiritual content. So I take films like The Godfather and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Casablanca, The Graduate, and kind of open them up to see the Dharma content of them, unintentionally there, but there. And the chapter. And by the way, I have to give a lot of credit to Maharishi for helping me develop that skill. I was a teaching assistant in the first couple of years when he founded a university, starting in 1973, Maharishi International University. And the whole approach there was to teach the standard disciplines of physics and literature and music and all that in the light of enlightenment. So I took to that like a duck to water. Someone pointed out to me recently, though, they said, yeah, Dean, but you know what? Of all of us who taught there in those days, you're the one who's really taken that thing, that looking into places where we don't expect to find Dharma and finding it there. So, I thought, that's interesting. Well, thanks, I guess. So, in any case, in that book, Cinema Nirvana, I write about my experience of kind of coming up against the more cultish aspects of the TM movement and having to finally leave it. And I did it in my chapter on Invasion of the Body Snatchers. And in particular, there's a moment in Invasion of the Body Snatchers where there's only two people left in town who've not been taken over by the emotionless aliens, who become like replicants of their bodies. Kevin McCarthy and I forget the woman's name, and they're going to have to navigate through the town and pretend that they've been taken over, and she's asking, well, how are we going to do it? And he said, just keep I forget the exact line, something like, just keep a vague smile and a blank look in your eyes. And I went, oh, I've seen that face. That's the face of my fellow, cultists. But I tell the story in that chapter of a few months, I think it was, after, I really left that TM nest. And I had brought up from the basement a box that had all my old notebooks from my years of going on courses and retreats with Maharishi. Page after page after page of these meticulous notes in handwriting, far neater than anything I'm capable of now. And here and there in the margins, joyful little poems of awakening and Jai Gurudev and, so forth. And I was just, and I was sitting there at the bottom of the stairs going through this, and my wife came in, and I was just sitting there looking at it and weeping. And I looked up at her and I said, I was a good disciple. And so I understand that sincerity of that commitment, which in itself is a it's a beautiful thing. But sometimes it's time to move on.
And how did you find your way?
Well, it was helpful to one of the actually a couple of the younger teachers at that Ram Dass retreat in 1993 were connected with Vajrayana teaching, specifically Dzogchen. So I started seeking out some, teachers of Dzogchen, and started getting more into the Buddhist teaching, and just got tremendous, I mean, obviously the teachings of the Buddha, the four noble truths, you see that everywhere. It's just, to me, the Four Noble Truths are like laws of physics. It's just the way it is. It's not a doctrine. It's an if the Buddha were around today, he'd be considered, I don't know, maybe a sociologist. The Four Noble Truths are observations of, this is how people screw themselves up, and this is how, they could stop doing that any time. That's the cessation of suffering.
Who did you study with?
I studied with, mainly I found myself with Western Buddhist teachers. One was Ngakchang Rinpoche, who's actually, he's British, he's Welsh. Spent some time with him, very colorful character. He wrote just fabulous, hilarious poetry. So Ngakchang Rinpoche, and in America, I wound up spending quite a bit of time with another Jewish boy from Long Island like myself, Lama Surya Das. And actually, my late first wife, Maggie, wound up being kind of a right-hand person to him on his retreats. So I went on a lot of his retreats, often, a month at a time during the summers, and that was great at the time.
Okay, I can't let it slide. Umbanda.
Let me just mention, I don't want to go into it now, but that just for the record, the Dzogchen Foundation, Lama Surya Das, eventually became a nest also that I had to leave. Yes, Umbanda, I ran into that. Actually, one of my Buddhist teachers, a wonderful Buddhist teacher from Switzerland named Charles Genoux, just a brilliant teacher. And he and his wife somehow got involved with Umbanda, some Umbanda teachers from Brazil. So I had some involvement with that for a while, and would participate in their, I can't remember the word now. It's the Brazilian word for circle. Their rituals, and I was actually learning to drum in those, which was great. Got some very valuable things, but that turned out after a while to be not something to continue to put time into.
Why not?
There was a point where to really to continue to participate in that in a wholehearted way, there was a certain kind of leap that one had to make that I felt I could not make that leap sincerely.
What would you consider your, I don't know, this is a bit of a strange question maybe, spiritual orientation to be now? Are you an independent mystic now? Do you, you've spoken about all of these influences positively, even though many of them, as you say, you reached a point where you departed from them. You've spoken highly of your rooting in TM and all that gave you, effortless meditation, which is a big theme of your teaching, actually. What would do you consider yourself to have a spiritual home or an orientation or a North Star now?
There was a point where I realized that we're eventually supposed to grow up. That eventually, I'm 72 years old, and I realized at a certain point we're supposed to become the elders that people rely on, I've just tried to use everything that I've encountered in my experience, in my reading, in my understanding, and use that to become available to people through my teaching, through my books. I would say the closest thing I have at the moment to a home, to someone, for my reality check, is Rupert Spira. Rupert is just, I think if you look up clarity in the dictionary, there's a picture of Rupert there. I think that with any kind of spiritual teaching or teacher, there's a ratio. I think this may be a useful way to think about it. There's a ratio of the juice to the bullshit. The juice is the stuff that you go there for. There's all the great, here's the here's the power of the methods, the revelatory power of the teachings, all that. And then here's, the personality quirks of the teacher. Here's the pain in the ass aspects of the organization. Here's the certain amount of doctrine or whatever that you're expected to swallow. There's always a certain amount. There's always a certain ratio. And it's when the ratio becomes no longer workable that if you're paying attention, you leave. All right. I would have to say Rupert, of all the teachers and teachings I've encountered, he's the one where I've never seen where the ratio was so high, just pretty much pure juice. And, I was on a retreat with him recently, and someone at the beginning of the first meeting of it was a 1-week retreat, had put some flowers up on his table there where he was going to sit. And the first thing he did was he had someone take them away. And he very graciously said, "Oh, thanks very much. That's too much like being," he said in his British way, "too much like being a proper guru." Right? And, he's just so alert to all those, the ways that one can slip in that. So I deeply appreciate that, having seen so many slips happen before.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, this has been so fascinating. Thank you for being so open in exploring your experiences here. The book, we mentioned it, the Dharma Guide to the Dharma Bum's Guide to Western Literature. I have my favorite chapters. I like the one a lot on the Great Gatsby. I like the Virginia Woolf chapter very much. These are some earlier chapters. I enjoyed them a lot. What's your, we can't possibly go into it. So all I'll say to people listening is buy it and read it, because it's really good. Mm-hmm. But what's your favorite chapter? That's what I'm curious about. And also, if it's an anecdote that's easy to tell, I don't want to kidnap you here and keep you hostage in this podcast. What was the most difficult chapter to write? I'm also kind of curious about that. And then maybe we can say a little about your website and your meditations that you offer, your free meditations and all these sorts of things. But let's just look. You're looking through the contents, I see. Yeah.
Yes, I'm looking for I just love how you ask questions, Steve, that other people don't ask. I'd have to think about what's the most difficult. If I had to pick one as my favorite, it would be Emily Dickinson. I mean, partly it's her, of course. You know, the person who writes, you know, not revelation 'tis that waits, but our unfurnished eyes. I mean, that is pure non-dual. That is Dzogchen in the highest, right? That the thing that we're looking for, we think is going to be some revelation, some text, some content, some understanding, or even some experience, that because that also is content. It's going to be purple flames shooting out of our crown chakra or something. That's all revelation. And that's all. None of that is it. It's our unfurnished eyes. It's not anything, no matter how spectacular, that we can be aware of. It's awareness itself. She was there, sitting alone in her second-floor bedroom in Amherst, Massachusetts. How does that happen? That it's so brilliant. So just her writing, and something about the way the whole shape and rhythm of that chapter came out for me, I was very pleased with. The music, you know, coming from a family of musicians, I'm very tuned into the music of writing, the rhythm, and also my wife. I'm now married for the second time. My first wife passed in 2004, and my wife now, Yatha Larea, is a superb documentary film editor and actually producer now. And so I learn a lot from her about rhythm and structure and arc. And something about that chapter, I felt, yeah, I got this one right. Yeah, I don't know what would be the most difficult. They're all, none of them are difficult. All of them are impossible. Until you do it. There's some quality of walking through a wall. Every time I start a book or start a chapter or start a day's writing, there's, oh no, this can't be done. This can't be done. And then, you know, you force yourself to do it, and it's, oh no, this is terrible, I'm writing shit. And fortunately, I've been through it enough times to know that what you do is, okay, you keep writing shit, and after a while something happens, you go through the wall, you find, and especially when you realize, oh no, this is the chapter, this is the one where I'm going to have to stop and apologize to the publisher and send the advance back. You know, there's no way for me to make it work. This is where I've met my Waterloo. Whenever that happens on that chapter, that's the one it turns out to be just great, because you had to go somewhere that you didn't think you could go.
Mm-hmm. What's your writing routine?
I have to have a contract and a deadline. Otherwise, it's much too easy to just sit around playing my ukulele and, you know, walking to the beach. You know, get up in the morning, have a nice breakfast with my wife, make excuses and distractions for a while, eventually get around to it, decide it's impossible, keep going. Then after a while, I catch fire and go for a while. Then it's time for dinner.
Great. Dean, this has been so wonderful. Could you say a little something about the many things you're doing? You have the Filmosophers podcast, you have your free meditations each week, you offer those. Can you say a little bit about that range of activities and where people can find out more about you?
Yes, if they come to my website, deansluyter.com, and you'll be showing them how to spell that, because it's a Dutch name and it's got a U in it.
We should say it, S-L-U-Y-T-E-R.
Sluy, U-Y as in by, as in guy. So deansluyter.com, and there you can connect with my Zoom meditations, which usually are 3 times a week. And Fridays I do it in the mornings so that it works as an evening time for people in Europe and thereabouts. I got one guy who dials in from Morocco, and that's free. It's open to everyone. And also, I have a YouTube channel. Just go to YouTube and search for Dean Sluyter, where I've got a number of my sessions archived there. I've got 5 other books that I wrote. All of that's on my website.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's been fascinating. I'd love to invite you back for a sequel sometime, and maybe we can discuss some of those books. Your book about movies, for example. I think that would be very interesting to dive into that. But anyway, regardless, this has been so great. Dean Sluyter, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you for listening to another Guru Viking podcast. For more interviews like these, as well as articles, videos, and guided meditations, visit www.guruviking.com.